I'm Diego Asencio. I joined the Foreign Service in 1957, if you believe. And, I left in 1986. My background is essentially Hispanic, and so this meant that I would be serving in Spanish-speaking or Portuguese-speaking countries. That was probably the crux of my career. Colombia was my first ambassadorial assignment. I was looking forward to that. Before going there, I did a little research. There had been a story in Time magazine saying that Italy was in the throes of a series of kidnappings. There were some 30-some-odd kidnappings, and it was tearing the society apart. When I got to Colombia, I asked the political section to do some research, and I discovered that there were 900 active kidnapping cases. So I figured that this was going to be a very interesting assignment. I didn't know it was going to be so directly interesting, but I enjoyed my assignment there. I like Colombians and Colombia, and I still have a lot of friends there. But the way this all started was, as you know, there's a tradition in the Foreign Service that you celebrate your national day and all your colleagues come. And the Dominican ambassador was doing this. He was a brand new ambassador and not a professional. So it was sort of a not very well organized party, but it was a noonday affair. And I was in a hurry to get out of there because I had a luncheon engagement. And I noticed out of the corner of my eye that the Iron Curtain ambassadors were leaving. So I figured it was time to go, and I began to head toward the door. And I was stopped by the Venezuelan ambassador who wanted to talk about some subject. And at that moment, 4 people came in and began shooting up the ceiling. And then they were followed by 8 others. And a shootout started between them on the inside and the police and my bodyguards on the outside, and eventually also with the arrival of the military. It was a tremendous shootout. I was on the floor trying to get under a sofa, and I was being sprinkled with glass as the bullets were coming in through the thing. And I produced probably the most sincere act of contrition of my career at that particular moment. But also, I had another less serious thought. One of my favorite authors is Norman Mailer, and I remember particularly The Naked and the Dead. I recalled that when most people were under fire in The Naked and the Dead, they had trouble controlling their bowels. And I thought to myself, gee, I'm not having that problem. So that sort of gave me some pause. But anyway, eventually they worked me over to the door and had me standing in the doorway yelling for the police to cease fire, which they did, fortunately. And we sat down, which for what I was sure was going to be a long siege. This was the M19, a paramilitary organization based on the sort of disgruntled participants in the party of General Rojas Pinilla. And they had raided an arsenal about a month before, and their leadership in effect had been put into jail. So they were doing this in order to try to effect the release of their leadership. They were generally, how would I say, a rather random lot. The commander had been a teacher and had been effective in some sort of teachers' union. His deputy was a woman who was a sociologist and had been working with Indians. Most of the others were either students who were rather bright and interesting, or gunmen, common, ordinary, hold 'em up, stick 'em up gunmen. So it was a rather interesting lot to try to assess how best to proceed with the thing. The commander read us his negotiating instructions. And I took him aside and I said, you know, you can't possibly go into a negotiation with those instructions. They're going to say you're a savage, someone who could only be dealt with by force, and they're going to come in here and shoot you. And he said, well, can you do better? And I said, well, this is what I do for a living. I said, I'm a negotiator. I can take the same thing you're supposed to be doing and put it in language that's acceptable to the other side. And he said, give me a draft. So I took the Mexican and the Brazilian and said, come along, we're going to redo the terrorist negotiating instructions. And we did. We sat down and worked out a very, very interesting document. And when the Colombian government saw that my draft was going to be used, they praised it, of course, as a means of trying to make sure that the terrorists would use it. And so this started the negotiation. Also, the negotiation was occurring in a van parked in front of the Dominican embassy, and I convinced the commander to allow the Mexican ambassador to sit in as a sort of witness to the negotiation with the female terrorist who was the negotiator. This was very helpful in many ways because eventually we turned the negotiator. She became convinced that following the instructions of her leader would be an absolute disaster, and she began taking advice from us, which again was very unusual. What complicated the situation, of course, was that the department was not aware that this was going on. And although we had access to telephones and we were talking to our families and to the embassy and so forth, the terrorists were listening in on wires, so you had to be very careful about what you said. And I recall, for instance, I suggested to my deputy chief of mission that he distribute the redrafted negotiation among the embassies who were represented in the abduction. And he said, well, you know, they're going to want to know why. And I said, well, you know, there's somebody listening in on this phone. So I'm not going to be able to be very explicit with you, but I want this. And of course, the department decided that it would be unseemly for the department to distribute the terrorist negotiating instructions. This was further complicated as we went on and began to make some progress with the fact that the Mexican ambassador felt that he had been insulted by the Colombian negotiators. He informed his government and they ordered him to withdraw from the negotiation. This was the guy who was giving the terrorist the terrorist negotiator instructions on how to proceed. And so again, I called the embassy and I said, please tell the department to tell the Mexican government to allow the Mexican ambassador back into the negotiation. And again, the question was, why? And I said, I can't discuss this. This is very, very important. They wouldn't do it. And this was, I'd say, probably a substantial part of the drama in the thing, that people a couple of thousand miles away sitting in air-conditioned comfort were making decisions while I was sitting there in the middle of the fire trying to work our way out of the negotiation. Just before I get into other detail, let me give you one point of the solution at the end. As I arrived in Florida, they had a psychiatrist waiting. And he said, we were all very concerned about why you wanted the Mexican ambassador to be sitting in on the negotiation. And I said, because we had turned the female negotiator and he was manipulating her. And he said, oh, well, that never occurred to any of us. I said, of course not. You figured that after 30 years of service, I'd flipped and turned over and gone over to the other side. That made more sense. And he said, you're sane. So, this incorporated me back into the life of the Foreign Service. But the other aspects that I found most interesting about the captivity was that I was concerned that we would wind up in some odd place, sort of a Gaddafi, Libya sort of situation, or so I was very concerned about where we would end up. And the negotiation proceeded, no, of course it took 61 days, but the negotiation proceeded in a rather positive vein. We would have regular debriefing sessions between us and the terrorist high command. And rather interesting. I figured someday this would probably make a good movie. But for instance, at one point the terrorists said, if we can't convince them on this point, maybe we should start shooting hostages. And that would give them an incentive to, and I said, I thought that was a rather stupid idea. It was seen to me that if you did that, you'd have to consider that the reason they were getting pressure from the government was that that was part of the negotiating process. And they were, in effect, playing the idiot role. And if the terrorists reacted in that way, they were idiots. However, if they tried to be more sophisticated, then they would be in a situation where they were actually handling things professionally. Fortunately, they listened to my advice, although they didn't always. The place itself, the Dominican embassy, was a rather ramshackle place. Obviously, the ambassador had not had great funds to fix the place. For instance, he didn't have a refrigerator. The furniture was rather ramshackle, and of course all the windows had been shot out. We were sleeping on the floor. All the ambassadors were in one room, and the other ranks were in another room, which I thought was rather hilarious for a presumably left-wing or radical organization. And we also had the big TV, and the other ranks had the small TV. Again, we would make jokes about this, but it was part of a very, very interesting situation. Also, we had problems among ourselves, in the sense that, for instance, the Swiss ambassador had a wife who was sending him large quantities of supplies. We had other people in the same boat, and we would sort of share them. He refused to share his, and eventually he was surrounded by boxes of material and sat in the corner, didn't mix with anybody. It was really a strange situation, so that, for instance, when the Red Cross came in to examine the situation, they sent a Swiss, and we said, would you check out your national there, because I think he's in bad shape. And he did, and he said, no, you don't understand, he's Swiss. And that's just the way it is. So other ambassadors were also peculiar. For instance, the Venezuelan began to suffer physically and eventually had to be medicated. The Uruguayan jumped out of a window in a hail of gunfire and actually made it to, I guess, the friendly lines. But this, in fact, complicated the situation, because then the terrorists increased their security measures. And the Israeli ambassador was my bunkmate. He had the Red Cross had given us some foam rubber pads as beds, and he had the section next to mine. And he was planning how to escape. And when we got close to the actual solution to the problem, he said to me, I wanted to tell you that I wasn't kidding, that I was planning on getting out of here and taking you with me, and let me show you what I was planning to do. So we went into the bathroom, and there was a window that had not been blocked and led to a niche in the building that wasn't under view from any of the shooting points of the terrorists. And it was about 1 story. He said, I was planning to jump out here and take you with me. And then we were going to dash to that wall there, that fence, and over the fence. And I figured we had a pretty good chance to make it. And I said, well, you should have told me. You know, it might have improved my attitude with regard to the situation. But also, there were some students that were quite bright among the terrorists. So we set up an ambassadorial lecture series. You know, we would talk about our countries and what have you, and the students would sit and listen, take notes, and ask questions and what have you. And I remember, for instance, at one point, one of them began talking about the oppression of the masses by the capitalist system and all that sort of stuff. And I said, what did your daddy do? And he said, oh, my daddy was an admiral. And I said, how about your daddy? Oh, well, he was a businessman, no, general manager of such and such a bank. How about you? And I said, you know, I'm the only member of the proletariat here. My father was a boat painter. And so I think, you know, we ought to reverse this situation and try to. It didn't work. It didn't work, but it caused quite a bit of merriment, which was a good way. And we also had some female terrorists. Some of them were quite attractive. And I remember, for instance, one of them dropped a shotgun, and it went off. And since we were surrounded by troops, we were afraid that they would come storming through the embassy because they figured we were being mishandled. And so the Mexican ambassador ran down to the door and stopped them in mid-tack, saying, it's all right, it was an accident, okay, no one was hurt, that sort of stuff. And I remember there was another instance where one of the ladies dropped a hand grenade, and it went down the stairs, and it made a very interesting noise going clump, thump, 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 and with everybody waiting for the explosion, and fortunately that didn't happen. So I would say there were obviously some tense moments. There was a lot of interplay, rivalry among the ambassadors. For instance, there was one situation where the negotiating group, the Mexican, the Brazilian, and I were in a room discussing approaches for the next day's negotiation, and the Israeli was sitting in listening, and the Costa Rican arrived. And he said, I want you to know that your colleagues are very unhappy. We don't like the way you're doing things. You're doing this all wrong, and as far as I'm concerned, for instance, he went up to the Mexican ambassador, who was a young ambassador. He said, you're just a snot-nosed kid, and I've been in the Foreign Service for 31 years. So he stomped out of the room, and I said, my God, you know, we must be doing something wrong. Perhaps we should spend more time briefing the other ambassadors on what is going on. And the Mexican had another idea. The Brazilian said, well, maybe we ought to do this. And the Israeli said, just a minute. He says, there's something funny here. He was a military man. He said, let me go do a little reconnaissance of the terrain. He said, all the other ambassadors were over in the library. So he went over and came back and said, you know, you with your tactics and stuff. He says, the problem is that you and I, this morning, unloaded the Red Cross supply truck. And the French ambassador had sent us a case of champagne. You and I carried it in here and put it in the closet in this room. They think we're in here drinking the champagne and not giving them any. So he and I picked up the case of champagne, carried it to the library, and dropped it in the middle of the floor and said, stuff it. So that was one of the sort of, how would I say, more dramatic moments. on the whole, the Colombian government was very supportive. We didn't see eye to eye on the approach to things. For instance, when we changed the instructions, we convinced the terrorists that they perhaps should show the instructions to their leadership, who all were in jail, of course. And I figured that this would give the Colombian government an opportunity to inform the people in jail that this was their occasion to do the right thing, and if not, they were going to suffer as a result. And the instructions went into the prison and came out of the prison, and no changes were made. So I couldn't figure out, when we were eventually released, the president invited me to dinner, and I said, "What the heck were you thinking when I laid the solution out for you, fully?" He said, "I realized what you were doing." He says, "But, we're a Napoleonic code country, and, this sort of stuff doesn't go. We don't do that." And I didn't want them to think that I did something untoward to resolve this situation. But, it was a good idea. So that sort of stuff went on. The Cuban ambassador visited us once we got down to almost the end of the negotiation and said, Fidel is prepared to send a plane to Bogota to take you all to Havana. And I said, well, I don't mind that per se, except for a couple of things. I want to make sure that you disarm the terrorists once they're on board. And two, you make sure that we're actually going to Havana instead of Libya or somewhere else. And he said, well, that's pretty funny coming from you, But he says, I'll take care of it, don't worry. So they sent an Ilyushin down, which was a very interesting looking aircraft. The only problem was I went to the bathroom on the plane, and I discovered that the roll of toilet paper was on a spike that had been hammered through the wall of the aircraft. And I said, I wonder if they treat their engines with the same lack of regard. But no, we arrived in Havana. That was my first and only trip there. I gave a press conference, and the Department of State had rented a plane to get me to Homestead Air Base. I arrived in Homestead, of course, to a almost delirious welcome, and the troops there were very kind, took care of us very well, and we gave a press conference there also. And then the Washington sent down Air Force One to take me back to Washington, which I thought was an indication that perhaps they were going to treat me well, despite our differences on how to approach the problem. And in fact, the Director General was on board, and he said, we want to make sure that you're rewarded for how you handle the situation. There are a couple of ambassadorships opening up. He said, how about Argentina? And of course, Argentina is one of my favorite places. My father, as a young orphan, had actually emigrated there and lived there for a while before he came to the United States. And however, there was, I better not use her name, there was a young Foreign Service officer, a friend of mine, who was helping, serving the drinks and so forth. And but then she would leave the group in the presidential cubicle and tell my wife what was going on. And then she'd come back and stand behind the Director General. And when he mentioned Argentina again, she would wave her head, no, no, no. So I'd say, what else? And he said, well, we have an assistant secretaryship opening up in the Bureau of Consular Affairs. And she went out and came back and again stood behind him and said, so I got my instructions from my wife sort of secondhand, and that was very, very helpful. I also was given the first new Medal of Valor, which then subsequently was used for the also for the Iranian hostages. There was a tremendous reception in the lobby of the State Department. There was a big press conference afterward. One of the more interesting aspects of the press conference was that I was asked why I had kissed all of the terrorist females before boarding my plane. And I said, I'm sorry, but I didn't do that. And it turned out that, of course, all of us had beards, and some of us also lacked head hair. And the Brazilian ambassador, of course, went around and kissed all the girls. So they thought that that was me. So I was able to point out that no, I didn't do that. I always considered that my career in the Foreign Service was a series of happy accidents. One of my advantages was that my father was a cultural chauvinist, and he insisted that I have a tutor to improve my Spanish. So while everybody else, having come home from school, was out playing ball, I had to sit and study, which bothered me immensely then. But it enabled me to be prepared to get a 5.5 on the language test. For instance, when I was assigned to Mexico, I was sent as an officer who would fill in for various consular employees to go to the Spanish language school in Mexico City. But when I arrived there, the consul general was in the midst of a crisis because they had just lost the chief of the Protection and Welfare Office. So I wound up in the Protection and Welfare Office instead, and eventually became the chief of the Protection and Welfare Office. Then, for instance, I went off to Panama, and one of the things that I had done in high school was learn how to type and take shorthand. And the next thing you know, I was the Secretary General of the Canal Immigrating Negotiating Commission, and which was a very, very interesting time. It was not successful, but as an experience was actually extraordinary. Then I became the Panama desk officer just in time for my ambassador in Panama to be made assistant secretary. So I became the special assistant to the assistant secretary. Then I was told, very, very tough job, incidentally. I don't recommend it to anybody. It was like, round the clock, Saturdays, Sundays, evenings, whatever. But I was told that if I did this for 3 years, I would get any assignment I wished. So on the 3rd year, I said, okay, I'm prepared to throw in my chips. I want to go abroad. And they said, where do you want to go? And I said, well, Madrid would be nice. They said, sorry, you were born in Spain, and it's against our policy. And they said, however, Portugal is available. And you can drive to Spain in a couple of hours. And as a matter of fact, nothing has happened in Portugal since 1928. So you could consider it a holiday. You sit on the beach for as long as you like, and when you get bored, call us and we'll get you back and give you a real job. And so I asked my wife, what about this? And of course, she had been suffering from the fact that she usually didn't see me until 8 or 9 o'clock at night. She said, is it a 9 to 5 job? I said, looks more like a 9 to 12. And she said, take it. So I did, and I got there just in time for the beginnings of the revolution. Particularly the socialist group was having demonstrations, and part of, I guess, my career advancement was that I discovered a technique that I didn't bother to tell the department about, that in Portugal at that time, if you wore a coat and tie and didn't have a beard, because if you had a beard, you were probably a university professor and therefore fair game. But if you were clean shaven and wore a coat and tie, the police wouldn't lay a glove on you. So I would attend all these riots and walk into the middle of them, and no one would lay a glove on me. I remember, for instance, once going into a square, and they had the old tank out with the purple ink, and it was coming in my direction. I said, well, there goes the theory on that one. And they saw me and stopped it and sent it the other way. So, again, very, very successful. So then I was expecting, that the idea of staying there a year and then coming back no longer made any sense. It was a very important post, and probably the place I've been promoted the fastest anywhere. I actually wound up as from the bottom of the political section to DCM in 5 years, which was very, very unusual. But I did want to go back to Spanish-speaking Latin America. And of course, they needed me in Brazil. And Brazil, I had been to Brazil, but I really knew very little about Brazil, except that I spoke Portuguese. And this was considered an absolute necessity, so I became the political counselor in Brazil. And one incident that I find absolutely hilarious. I'd only been there like less than a week, and the only Brazilian I knew was a journalist, a top-flight journalist, who had been sent to Portugal on a leader grant, and who I used to meet regularly and chat. And he would take me around and introduce me to everybody. So he said to me, you should be aware that there's a plot against the finance minister. They're trying to get him out of the government. I said, well, how interesting. So at the next staff meeting, I got up and said this. And of course, the economic counselor and the treasury attaché were absolutely flabbergasted and angry, and told me that, I had just gotten there and I barely knew where the men's room was, and to come up with stuff like that was absolutely ridiculous. And so a couple of days later, again, my friend ran into me at a cocktail party, and I said, you got me into all sorts of trouble with that statement. And he said, come with me. And we went to the back room of this particular place, and there was the Minister of Finance. And he said, tell him. So I went back to the embassy, the next staff meeting, and when they began to jump up and down, they said, where are you getting this material? And I said, from the finance minister, which I loved. It was a great, great particular moment in my career. But from there, I was sent to Venezuela as a DCM with one of my favorite ambassadors, Harry Schlotterman, and then Pete Vakey, also one of my favorite ambassadors, people that I use as role models and who were, I think, really the top of the line officers in Latin America. I learned a lot from them, and they were very, very helpful to me. From there, I went to Colombia, and that's where this story about my shenanigans with the M19 started, and allowed me to write a book that I would like to urge you to take a look at, and maybe you might get some pointers. I've also written a memoir which you might find useful also, where some of the stuff goes, where I have a lot more detail about these things that occurred during the course of my career, a 30-year career that I think was eventful. The end of the story was that after I left the Foreign Service, I went to work for the Una Chapman Cox Foundation. And then after that, I wound up as chairman of the Commission on Immigration that had been developed or set up by the Immigration Reform and Control Act of, I guess it was 87. And also, I wound up being sent to Moscow to investigate the Marine Guards at a time when there had been some problems with our intelligence elements in Russia. And the theory had been that the Marine Guards had had a party with a bunch of ladies at the embassy at night, and they turned out to be KGB ladies, and they might have gotten into the code room. Didn't turn out to be the case, but it was a very, very interesting time. Thank you very much.